Hello, my name is Collie Brown. Today I want to talk to you about why African contracts are so bad. African contracts over the years have not been very good. And when we take a look, one should ask the question, why are African contracts really so bad? Before we answer that question, let's just take a look at some of these contracts. So we know that many of the contracts are actually contracts that deal with raw materials, resources, because Africa has a lot of raw materials and resources that they sell overseas. Now, so the contracts are negotiated and the raw materials leave Africa. Also, there are contracts to build roads, build bridges, build infrastructure, and also to improve infrastructure. And we know that those contracts themselves are also very bad. And when we say bad, what do we mean? We mean that the contracts are disproportionately in the favor of the other party, not the African party, but the other party that they sign the contracts with. And this is true, by the way, of almost any contract. It doesn't matter whether it's a contract with an Asian country, a European country, or some other country. As long as the country is out of Africa or outside of Africa, the contracts are bad, universally bad. So let's take a look at the decision-making process because, when you ask Africans why these contracts are so poorly written, many of them default to corruption. They say it's corruption that is the real driver for these contracts to be so bad. It can't be that reasonable people, educated people, are making such bad decisions. There has to be something nefarious going on. There may be some truth to that, but is that the complete picture? Is it that the people who are signing these contracts are universally crookish, universally bad? They're all taking bribes and whatever else they do for the contracts to be so lopsided. If you haven't liked or shared this video, please like, share, and subscribe. The decision-making process. In order to make a decision, a couple of things are needed. One, you must know short-term what you're trying to fight for or what's in the contract. What is it that your aim, your objective is? What is your longer-term aim? And it's important that you know those two because if you don't, what might work good in a short-term scenario might be very bad and vice versa. Information. What exactly are you negotiating? Do you understand the ramifications of the terms of the conditions that you're negotiating or the contract is covering? For example, if you are making a particular highway and you have a contract for that highway and you're going to sign that contract with some external party, how big is the highway? How big should the highway be? How much is the highway going to cost? Do you have the money up front? Is it part of an aid package? Are you getting too much road, hence bigger debt than you need? In other words, does the infrastructure, if it's a case of infrastructure, does the infrastructure justify the size of the contract? If you're creating a road in a small village, you certainly wouldn't need to negotiate a 5-lane single-way highway. When we talk about things like resources, let's say you've discovered bauxite and the African country needs to negotiate a mining concession with some third party outside. The question then becomes, do they have enough information? Does the African country have enough information about these types of contracts? Short-term and long-term objectives and goals. Do they have that information? Is it comparable, the information that you have, with similar projects in other countries? Can it be developed by you? In other words, You borrow the money, get the equipment, and you do the mining of this? Or do you need them to come in and plunk their money down? If they're investing the money up front, for example, to mine a particular concession, what is their rate of return on the stuff they mine? In other words, are they making exceeded big, exorbitant profits, when they mine this particular concession? What is their profit margin is basically what I'm asking. And so after you've sort of nailed all of those down, in front of you now is a stack of information that you're going to need to process. That is how normal decision-making processes are done. Now, when we take a look at one particular decision, for example, the airport in Uganda, the Entebbe airport, that contract was a $200+ million contract to fix the airport and to turn the airport into a more modern facility. And they ran into trouble. The contract was in 2015. They ran into trouble in 2021. And the question was whether or not the Chinese were going to come back and take that. Now, my first question is, I know people would say, again, it's corruption. People couldn't be that bad in terms of actually negotiating something. But I suspect that it is not corruption that's the driving force. It's the lack of information. In other words, the way decisions are made. Before you can justify $200 million on a particular airport, you have to understand the revenue model of that airport. In other words, how many passengers are passing through that airport? And what is the economic value that they are leaving behind? In other words, if you go to that airport and you are, let's say you're flying in or flying out, or you are using it as a transfer point, and you stop, for example, in a restaurant and you have to have some food, that is an economic value because you're spending money. If you buy things in terms of, in the concession stores at the airport, that's economic value. If you have to stay overnight and in the area and you need hotel, that's economic value. So the rate of economic value, the growth that is critical to see how much you can spend on the improvement of that airport. And also the kinds of things, the kind of facilities and so forth that you can put in the airport, because all of that has to be justified by the economic value the airport is going to generate. And we know from the news that that particular airport was almost repossessed by the Chinese government. And the question is, how did it happen like that? The people said, who negotiated on behalf of the locals, that they did not take any corruption. It was not corruption. So if it's not corruption, how was it so bad? How did they misjudge? How did they borrow more than they could safely or reasonably pay off from the increased revenue generation from the improvements? Why was it so difficult? It was difficult, my suspicion is, because they did not have the data to support the loan they got. And every loan has an economic value, and it has also a repayment rate. And that repayment rate was higher than the economic value that the airport could generate. Hence, they didn't have enough money to pay it. Hence, the loan itself was in default. It is my personal belief that it was because they didn't have the proper necessary research, the data, on which to underpin the size of the loan. In addition to that, there is something really, really troubling about that contract and many other African contracts. And that is the parties that they signed the contract with. Normally, a typical contract is, let's say you're going to build an airport. So the contractors sign the contract, but they tend to hire local people. So some of the cost, even though the money is coming out of the government's budget, some of it is being retained in the country because the workers are local. And so the economic benefit for that stays local. But in many of these contracts, we see that the workers who create the actual work and the raw materials used all come from overseas. In other words, the people who would normally fix the airport, a few of them would be able to use the airport, which generates that economic value. But since none of these people are local, all the economic value that's generated is going overseas. And that is a big reason why the loan was non-performing after a very short period of time. When we look at the decisions for raw materials and resources, it is clear to me as a person outside looking at these contracts that the parties negotiating on behalf of Africa or African countries and entities do not fully understand the economic value to both themselves and the other party. In other words, it is in the interest of the other party to get very favorable terms and conditions. And for the Africans, the reverse is true. To get the most out of the deal from the African perspective. In other words, drive the hardest bargain. But that requires the African party to be able to understand the business model of the other party. You have to know their business model and the kind of revenue that they're going to make with this mining concession. And when you understand their profit margins and their revenue stream, you're in a better position to negotiate with them and drive a better deal for Africa. Again, we come back to information. Some of it, I'm sure you can chalk it up to things like bribes and other things. But the truth is, a lot of it is because the people who are negotiating do not know. If you're negotiating with somebody for raw materials in a mining concession and you do not understand their business model, how do you know they're paying you or you're asking for the right amount? Do you understand the demand that this particular resource, because remember now, the resource you have, 30 or 40 other entities outside your country might want access to that. And do you just take the first one? Are the people suffering in such a case where you have to take the first money that comes along? Do you know the value of the entity that you're negotiating? It is my understanding and it is my personal belief that most of the people who are doing these negotiations do not understand the real value of the item they have. And that explains why the contracts are so bad. So, to sum it all up, in order to negotiate contracts that are balanced, that are fair for both Africa and third parties, it is important that Africa has the information, understand all the parameters that go into this negotiation from both the African side and also from the external party side. Africa and Africans need to do their homework before they sign the next contract. They need to study and understand what they have and how competitive or the demand for it is on the global market. And secondly, they have to be able to study the business model, the revenue model of the party that they're negotiating with, so that they know that they're getting the maximum from each contract. Once Africa starts to do that, even with corruption, the contracts are going to be much more balanced. And Africa and Africans will begin to truly benefit from their resources. If you haven't liked or shared this video, please like, share, and subscribe.